Hi, I'm Alan Rusbridger, editor of Prospect Magazine, and you're about to watch the interview portion of the latest episode of Media Confidential with myself and Lionel Barber, in which we speak to a special guest. If you want to watch the full episode, please click on the link below, and if you want to subscribe to Prospect Magazine, please visit our website at www.prospectmagazine, all one word, .co.uk. Enjoy. So we're really pleased to be joined by Bruce Daisley, who's a former vice president of Twitter for Europe, the Middle East and Africa. Welcome, Bruce, to Media Confidential. Perhaps you could just start talking about the work you were doing on Twitter to give us some sense of what Twitter was like before the day that Musk bought it.
Yeah, I think Twitter's always felt flawed from the outside, and that was never taken as a given. So even before Musk bought it, people used to declare it to be an infernal hell site. We did try to make it a slightly more palatable version of what it was, and so I was responsible for Twitter across Europe, Middle East, and Africa, and the job effectively was trying to defend the organization's reputation, and that might have been to try and win political support or support from high-profile users. And then we also just tried to expand the reach of Twitter. Twitter's not evenly distributed in different countries. And then ultimately bring revenue in. So it was about audience, reputation, and revenue, really, the job was.
And the bits that Musk was the first to disband were around things like trust and safety. You were trying to minimize bad content, in inverted commas, and you were trying to promote the most useful and reliable content. Can you just talk a bit about those teams and what the aim? I know it was with mixed success, but at least there was an intention there, wasn't there?
It was. I mean, the one thing that you encounter when you're a British person, or actually any non-American joining a tech firm, is that you learn very quickly that the things that might be on your agenda aren't necessarily on the agenda of the Silicon Valley firm. So, candidly, we had a series of episodes where we saw a lot of abuse directed at feminist campaigners. We saw a lot of abuse directed at black footballers. And, from our perspective, we thought, well, these things are relatively easy to resolve. But what we found generally was that the headquarters, and I think this is true across all tech platforms, headquarters generally weren't that interested, because as Musk then went on to really clearly evidence, these things are expensive. It costs you, if you use a simple metaphor, it's far easier to run a leisure centre with no lifeguards around the swimming pool than it is to try and keep everyone safe there. And broadly, what you find is that these functions aren't lavishly expensive, but they do require resource, because if someone reports something, a pair of human eyes needs to take a look at that and decide whether it's acceptable or not.
Tell us how many lifeguards you actually had operating at Twitter.
Yeah, but that's one of the reasons why I frequently say to people that if we wanted to get more political control over these platforms, or just a sense of governmental autonomy over what happens inside our countries, one of the best questions you can ask tech platforms is, how many people do you have full time working on administering these things? And the caveat I normally add is, how many native English speakers working in the United Kingdom? And the reason why I give that caveat is that at Twitter, at any stage, we might have had a team of 30 people in total, but that generally means about 6 people at any time working on it. And what you principally find is that this work migrates very quickly to the cheapest place to do it. And so what you find is that we would have a group of 6 people in Hungary administering, trying to decide whether tweets are acceptable or not. Now, what you find is that, and anyone who's received abuse online will recognize this.
Hungary is not the most obvious place, but there we are, given Mr. Orban in power.
Yeah, what you very quickly find is that the abuse generally comes in quite colloquial expression. It comes in. It often comes in memes, or it comes in swear words. And so, if someone isn't speaking English as a native language, what you discover is that there's an incentive for the agent reviewing it to say that there's no abuse. Because if you say there's no abuse, then generally there's no appeal, and so they don't get their work rechecked by their manager. So if someone reports abuse, if the agent viewing it says this is fine and passes it, generally the person abusing it gives up, but the person being banned isn't banned. And it's generally those people who request a review.
Okay, let's move to Musk, though. I think we should move to Musk and what happened in the Musk era. And does he have any? Is there any reason to suggest he's right in that, a lot of speech was being filtered or censored, and that the tilt towards more free speech is actually not a bad thing?
You could definitely make a case that some of the things that might be considered subject to nuance and discussion were treated absolutely. And, probably themes of gender are the most obvious ones, where you could say that the platform got into a degree of editorial control. Principally, that was because I think often transgender or non-binary people were subject to disproportionate amounts of abuse. They were subject to pylons that often were completely disproportionate. And so as a result, many platforms decided that deliberately misgendering someone, was going to be an actionable event. So someone could get suspended. Now, what you often found is that if that was just in discourse, there was no action taken. It was mainly when it was targeted. So people setting out to send abuse to a particular person. Now, you might say, well, look, themes of gender they enter into realms of opinion. You could make that claim. And so you could say that for platforms to get involved in saying that certain things weren't permitted was overstepping the mark. I think if you're trying to mark Musk's homework with a favorable eye, you could take that stance.
But the other thing he did was that Twitter had thrown a number of people off the platform, and he invited them all back on the platform, didn't he? And the people like Alex Jones and Andrew Tate, Tommy Robinson, they were all welcomed back despite their record of using the platform for disinformation, for stirring up hatred, for creating the conditions for violence. I mean, this was all part of Musk's attachment to a different idea of speech, isn't it? That if you're a libertarian, West Coast American, you don't really believe in any shackles on speech, or that at least is the claim made for it. Whereas there's a different tradition in Europe, isn't there?
Yeah, that's right. And look, what you often find is that people from certain perspectives, they don't necessarily get a full insight into the abuse that other people experience. And so, what we have found is that abuse disproportionately falls onto minority ethnic groups, it falls onto minority sexuality groups, it falls onto women. And so someone like Musk, who doesn't fall into any of those categories, probably gets a different form of abuse than a lot of people receive. Or someone like him, he might just brush it off because he's the richest guy in the world. How can anyone hurt him? So, yeah, he's definitely decided he wants a different version. It's an interesting take on this, because this immediately becomes the subject that you can frame as free speech. And in fact, the notion of free speech sounds so intoxicating that it's often used as an argument for everything. Over the last week, we've seen the arrest of the CEO of Telegram. And people who have an issue with that have screamed, well, this seems to be injurious for free speech. But it's worth saying that most of the things he was arrested for were more related to child sexual material that was on the platform, and the fact that the platform was used for illegality. I think it's a very convenient excuse to try to say that actually he was setting out to be the home of free speech. it's expressly using that as a means to try to disguise everything else that happened under the umbrella, I think.
Right. Well, we'll come to Durov in a minute, but I want to talk about the riots. You've been outspoken. You think that Musk and Twitter have been an enabling element in stoking violence on the streets in the UK, don't
Well,
you?
I think the take that I've got is that if we find ourselves in a situation where a platform is being weaponized, then we shouldn't say to ourselves, this is outside of our jurisdiction and there is nothing we can do. And so I'm not necessarily saying expressly that anyone should be arrested, but what I am saying is that in my experience, and I worked at YouTube, I worked at Twitter before it was X, but I also have a lot of friends who worked at TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, and the thing I know really clearly is that the threat of personal legal liability is far more mobilizing than any prospect of corporate fines.
Well, that's true. But do you believe that these social media platforms were being weaponized this summer, stoking riots in the country? Is that your view?
Yeah, most definitely.
And what would you point to?
I think at times there's two things where there's two things on a platform where you can see that the platform has been used for has been exploited. The first one is allowing false information to be peddled and to develop momentum. And look, critically, what platforms generally can't do is they can't be the arbiter of truth. They can't verify every tweet. However, when things are very clearly intent on peddling misinformation, what you would previously do, and what most platforms do but don't talk about, is they operate something called shadow banning, where effectively certain tweets, if they are harmful, even if you don't want to take them down, what you do is you prevent them being amplified by the algorithm. And what we've seen on X is the inflammatory tweets have not only been promoted by the algorithm, they've been promoted by the owner of the business. Musk has famously gone out and reposted, retweeted patently untrue allegations about what the British government is doing. He set about amplifying these things both personally and through the algorithm. And I think those things are actionable. I think we should be able to take a view that, firstly, I think it shouldn't be down to the platforms themselves to have the final say of whether Tommy Robinson should be allowed to use the platform, whether Andrew Tate should be allowed to use the platform within our own geographical boundaries. We should be able to call the shots on that. But in addition, I think there should be the ability for us to assert that we don't want certain toxic tweets and certain toxic messages to be amplified.
Well, Musk predicted in as many words that there could be or would be a civil war eventually in the UK as a result of immigration and tensions in these inner cities. That's an opinion. You wouldn't necessarily strike that down, would you?
No, absolutely.
No. So that's harder to deal with. But would you be proposing new regulation of the platforms in the wake of the summer violence in the UK?
Yeah, I think platforms need to demonstrate accountability. And we're seeing some of this playing out in Brazil right now. So critically, I think as we entered 2024, we knew that there were more elections around the world than anywhere else. And one of the things that's been raised in Brazil is there are a large number of weaponized misinformation accounts that are deliberately posting false information. And Brazil took issue with that and said that this is in many ways subverting democracy. It's not about one person giving an opinion.
A judge on the Supreme Court in Brazil.
Yeah, that's right. And there was a ban implemented. They asserted that these things needed to be taken into hand. There was a fine levied. And Musk not only has, in a quite infantile way, taken to abusing the Brazilians and the judges involved, but they've just not complied with it. And it just strikes me that if you've got platforms that have this degree of influence, the anti-democratic action here is not having them be accountable to elected governments. And I think that's the challenge that Musk and his ilk, we sort of hesitate to use the word oligarch, but an oligarch is a really good description, a supremely rich person with large amounts of political influence. And until now, the oligarchs from the tech world have used their influence lightly. You know, the likes of Mark Zuckerberg or the Google founders haven't really tried to intervene in politics, domestically or internationally. What we're seeing with Musk is something which is far closer to our notion of oligarchs. He's trying to only have an impact on the US election, but he appears to be trying to influence politics around the world.
Bruce, there's been a 30-year discussion about whether the tech companies are more like a telephone company or more like a newspaper. And initially, the legislation treated them more like a telephone company. You can't be responsible for what's going down the pipes of a telephone company. And there's been a big debate now as to whether they should be treated more like newspapers, that they should have this responsibility. So you've talked about personal liability. I mean, the way the law seems to be going in Europe and in the UK is not to say, yes, you are liable for every single piece of content, but that you have to show that you've got the processes and mechanisms in place to deal with systems that are going wrong. Can you just talk a bit about how that regulation is going to work and what jeopardy it has for the Musks of this world?
Yeah, I mean, look, you probably know more about this than me from first-hand exposure to Meta. Look, I think critically we need demonstration of good faith from tech firms that they are willing to engage and interact. And actually, if anyone's curious about what this looks like, then Germany's a really good example of it. In Germany, there are very clear rules asserting how Nazi information can be posted online. And if you ever doubt that tech firms can react very quickly, and react, I think, is the critical thing. They're not doing this proactively, but when something is reported, tech firms in Germany generally get Nazi content down in about 5 to 10 minutes. They've got an ability to react. Now, the critical thing is that Mark Zuckerberg was out last week saying that maybe COVID interventions had gone too far. Yeah, he would say that because it's immensely cheap not to intervene. It's immensely cheap not to have any checks and balances. And I think what we do know is that these firms, when run properly, can be highly profitable businesses. There's no reason why there shouldn't be some degree of accountability of these firms that have become the utilities of modern life, and don't always love our attempt to try and apply an old-fashioned heuristic to whether it's a cat or a dog. But because they're different, and actually the convenience of trying to apply an old model is kind of irrelevant. But we should know that these things can be run for the public good, and there probably is a strong need for that.
The stick in Germany, if I'm right, was enormous fines. I mean, really, really ginormous fines. But what we're now talking about with the DSA, the European legislation, and the online safety harms bill, the online harms bill in the UK, is actually personal liability that the executives themselves could be arrested, as we've seen happening with Durov. And you're saying that I think you're saying that's the only thing that they understand.
Yeah, and that is a part of the German law. It's also in Australia as well. And so I saw this firsthand. If you remember the horrors of the Christchurch shooting a few years ago now, one of the things that was happening at the time was that a lot of the content from Christchurch was being re-uploaded to social platforms, and it was proving immensely difficult to take down. At the time, in Australia, there was personal liability on executives to get this taken down. And let me tell you, nothing produces more immediate response than people feeling that they are in personal jeopardy. And so, that's what I would emphasize, that big fines don't mean a lot to the likes of Google and Meta. They've demonstrated they've both received billion-dollar fines in the EU, and it hasn't radically changed their approach to doing business. the best way that we can try and do this is the threat or the prospect of individual liability. And so that's why I raised the prospect that Elon Musk could find himself with a summons, a writ. If he landed in the UK, he's a playboy. If anyone wants to track Elon's movements, there's an Instagram account that tracks Elon's jet week to week, and he's in Europe every couple of months. And so, if he found himself suddenly recognizing he was liable for what he was doing in countries beyond the US, I think it would probably focus his mind a little.
What did you make of the episode this summer where the European Commissioner Thierry Breton wrote to him a kind of warning shot across his bows, and Musk's response, forgive my French, was to say, "Go fuck yourself." Does Musk realize what he's doing there? What's the game?
Just this last weekend, he told the judge in the Brazilian Supreme Court that he was going to end his life in jail. So, these are, the closest comparison, these are Trumpian ways to respond. And, Trumpian responses do move the open window about what you think are acceptable and what are not acceptable. But I think it demonstrates that Musk still perceives himself as being some way above the law and some way above international regulation. He's also got an army of 1 million minions who follow him, who are willing to abuse and tackle online anyone who speaks up, and anyone who's received a lot of the tick heads, the blue tick people who pay for his subscription and receive the abuse from them, will know that they're a pretty effective force that can be quickly mobilized. I think it's demonstration that he's kind of thumbing his nose at other democracies. It's almost challenging them to say you can't do anything about this.
If we stay for parochial for just a moment to wrap up, do you think that the UK will wait for Brussels to act first under the Digital Services Act? Or do you think that something may happen in Parliament with new regulation or legislation?
Challenge is it's taken us about 5 or 6 years to get to the law that's just passed. And before it's even been implemented...
This is the online...
The Online Safety Act, yeah. And it's pretty clear, before it's even been implemented, it's not fit for the job. You can read it and try and fill in some of their gaps, thinking, well, if they push this here, push this there, effectively it's about protecting children first and foremost. There is stuff in there about racial hatred and stirring up racial hatred, but it doesn't speak to the weaponization of these platforms, and it doesn't speak to, I guess, corporate, just the sense of corporate rules being abandoned, corporate niceties. Most of the law is kind of like an unwritten constitution. It just presumes these companies are going to be broadly positive in their approach or broadly consensual in their approach. So it's not fit for the task. The challenge then is, if it's taken us this long to get this, is there really going to be the appetite to either amend it and redo it? So I suspect we are going to see something from Europe before we see something in the UK. It also raises the question, of course, is Ofcom an organisation that has had rings run around it by GB News of all operations? Is Ofcom really fit for this task?
And apart from its flabby behavior over GB News, what makes you think that it would struggle with this kind of task?
I just think this is non-linear in terms of the way it comes up. I don't think they've demonstrated any muscularity in dealing with very traditional media, and how they would seek to respond to someone as maverick and unpredictable as Musk just seems to be a test of anyone. And for me, I've not seen enough to make me think Ofcom is ready to step up to this.
Bruce, thank you so much for joining us today. That's been fascinating.
Thank you, Bruce.
Thank you both.